Okay, good.
All right, well, welcome. I hope you guys have been enjoying the conference. I'm Becky Linger. I am the coordinator of the Kanawha Valley chapter, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Before I get started with her bio and tell you guys how wonderful she is, I wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping on our trip today. We will have a lecture in this room, and then we will be carpooling to some local sites. Of course, we're going to be going up to the Three Rivers Avian Center. They're going to have a program up there for all of the birds that have been rescued and are unable to be returned to the wild. And then, of course, some of the birds that are rehabilitating so that they can be released. So it's a wonderful center to be seen. The one thing is that one of our stops is going to be on an overlook that is not really that big. And so I am encouraging that we really seriously carpool, okay? There is probably space in the overlook turnout for about 8 cars. And last night, when Keith was announcing things at dinner, he said, you know, for the Brooks Island overlook, I bet you guys didn't know what he was talking about. That's what he was talking about, so I'm going to explain what we're talking about. Is that we're going to be driving down a road, I've got to start over again. Okay. So there's a sign-up sheet going around, so make sure that you sign up. I'm giving some detail about what's going to happen after this meeting. That's good. So there's like 7 to 6. There's you. You're not going to. So for the Brooks Island overlook, all right, what I'm planning to do is I will be in the lead car. I'm going to drive up to the far end of it and turn around because it's on the left-hand side so that we're facing back the way we came. What I'm really wanting everybody who is driving to do is follow me like ducklings. When I stop, don't everybody turn in. It's too narrow for that, and there is a curve and we could get hit, okay? So what would be better is for you guys just to follow me so that as we make our turn, we all are being aware that we're not going to get hit by another car. And then I'll pull all the way up to the front of the overlook park, and then we can go out. The reason that we're going there is that there's an eagle's nest out there, and it is active. There's the mommy and the daddy, and there are a couple fledglings in there. The fledglings are already flying. One of them has learned how to fish, and they were very active yesterday in the rain. So I have a feeling that they're going to give us a really good show today, okay? So after that, we're going to go to Three Rivers Avian, and that is the other part of my announcement, is that the road to Three Rivers Avian is a very typical West Virginia back road. I drive a Volkswagen Passat with front-wheel drive only, and luckily Ellen Rabowski was driving because she has a 4-wheel, and we're going up this hill, and I said, I'm not going to be able to do this in my car. So I have Ellen's car. But what I would say is that if you're willing to drive, if you have a high occupancy vehicle that has 4-wheel drive, you should volunteer to drive. And all cars should be filled because we're going to have trouble at the overlook to be able to stop and see. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? Okay, you're savvy to my pattern. After Three Rivers, we will go down to the John Henry Memorial Park. This is kind of a thing I'm trying to figure out. They say that they have an outdoor area at Three Rivers where we can eat our lunch. We may be eating our lunch in the cars with the rain. But with that, are there any questions about anything that I've already stated? Good.
So if you have a lower car, don't drive? Right? I mean, what kind of roads are that?
The roads are they're gravel road. They are not rutted. They were not rutted on Thursday night with all the rain yesterday, God knows. But they look like they're pretty stable roads. But because it's gravel and it's an incline, I know with my car I don't have the grip because I have front wheel drive, so I would just spin. So that's the thing. If you've got a really low slung car, if you've got like a Cougar or whatever the heck those things are, don't bring that. But if you've got an SUV, yeah, that would probably be fine. Subarus are fantastic.
So why don't you ask the group how many people have 4-wheel drive?
How many people have 4-wheel drive? Okay.
So that's gonna answer your question on how many people are gonna be able to get up there.
Yeah.
You wanna
Great.
rethink this? You wanna rethink this?
I don't know how to. But what else can I do?
I mean, what you're saying is we're not gonna be able to get up the road.
We may not. If you've got rear wheel drive, you'll probably be okay. If you have front wheel drive going uphill, I see that I spin.
Is there a way for the people with the SUVs to come back down and pick up people, you know, say everybody who's got a regular car, leave it down below somewhere and have people bring us back and forth? I mean, I don't know the distance or anything, but.
There may be. Three Rivers 80 and up there, it's about an hour. No, it's about, I think it's about 1.5 miles, 2 miles uphill. So yeah, we possibly could ferry people.
Are the DNR vans available?
No,
There isn't.
but there are no DNR vans.
Well, we used one yesterday to go to Brush Street.
Really?
Yeah.
There are no DNR vans available. Okay, so we're gonna see how this goes.
What about
Don't
ground-
panic.
What about ground clearance?
Ground clearance is pretty good. It's a fairly flat road. The problem is that it's the small gravel. So what I was seeing was that you might have trouble with traction, and I might be really paranoid with this, but make sure everybody signs the sign-in sheet. If your name's not on if you haven't set the sign, you don't get credit. All right.
How long a hill are you talking? Is it uphill for a mile? Or is it
Yeah,
uphill
it's
for
uphill.
100 yards?
No, it's uphill and then it flattens out and it goes up and it's up and then you gotta turn and it's up. It's not like this, but it's like about like that. And then there's the turn, it gets a little bit wacky.
Okay. Can you just back up?
Yeah, you can always back up.
Sore neck.
Yeah.
Back up.
All right, so we're gonna get started with our talk in here. So our speaker today is Jessica Reese. And Jessie grew up in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and she studied biology as an undergraduate at James Madison University. She received her master's degree in 2017 from Virginia Commonwealth University. She has also worked with the non-governmental conservation organizations and federal agencies to study migratory birds and their habitats on the breeding and wintering grounds throughout North and South America. She joined the Natural Resources Conservation Service and the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources Enhancement Project in southern West Virginia. No, I skipped a line. So she joined the NRCS and the DNR as a partner avian biologist in 2018 to manage the cerulean warbler forest land enhancement project in southern West Virginia. That's really good. I'm glad that she's working on that. Where she writes management plans to create habitat on private lands for this imperiled songbird. So I give you, now I've already forgotten your name. Jessie Reese. You guys have terrified me about the road because I terrified you.
Great, so thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I think we'll probably need to turn some lights down.
Yeah, here, let me take care of that.
Maybe
We've
not
got,
all the way down.
how's that?
Is that too dark? You guys happy?
Okay.
Okay.
That? All right.
Good. And can everyone hear me? Is this an okay volume to be speaking at, or do I need to amp it up? Okay, so maybe a little bit louder. Is this better? Okay. So, yeah, I'm excited to be here talking to you all during this conference. You know, I am happy to share the information that I know with you about Raptors, but I'm happy to have this be as interactive as y'all want it to be. I know that you all have a lot of expertise as well, and so I'm hoping that I could maybe learn some from you all as well. So just to sort of give me an idea about, like, you know, what level of knowledge you all have, I'm just sort of curious. So we're gonna play like a little quiz time. So just like raise your hand. So raise your hand if you've been a master naturalist for 1 year.
Okay. So our hands will go down as we.
Yeah. So for one year at least. At least 1 year. So we've got some new folks. At least 2 years. At least 3 years. 5 years. 10 years. Okay. So we've got a mix. We've got some veteran master naturalists here. Raise your hand if you consider yourself a bird watcher or a birder. A few of you. Okay. Raise your hand if you enjoy birds. Yeah. And so I'm guessing that all of you who raised your hands for enjoy birds, are you like, you're watching them at your bird feeder and around your house and that kind of stuff? You're a bird watcher. You are. You can count yourself in that ranks. And so in terms of raptors in particular, is there anyone here who really enjoys looking for them and learning about them? Quite a few of you. Okay, great. Well, certainly, you know, as Becky mentioned, I'm from Virginia, so I haven't spent that much time here in West Virginia, so I'm happy to, you know, absorb the knowledge that you all have locally from being here, certainly. So, you know, today I'm going to talk about population status of raptors in West Virginia. A lot of this information is going to come from our breeding bird atlas. So West Virginia recently completed its second breeding bird atlas. Is anyone familiar with the breeding bird atlas? Maybe some of you all volunteered for it? You did? Great. So could you share with the group, like, what is a breeding bird atlas?
Well, it was a while ago. It wasn't recently, and it wasn't just birds of prey, but it was songbirds, and it was in a local area in the Eastern Panhandle. Walked a certain period, specific area, stopped, listened, wrote down the different birds that we saw for a certain period of time, and then went on to another point and turned it all in.
Great. And so that occurred not just in the Eastern Panhandle, but all across the entire state. So the state kind of got divided up into these different blocks called an atlas block. And volunteer surveyors would go out and report what birds they were seeing and hearing and report evidence of breeding behavior. So did you see a bird carrying nesting material? Did you find a bird's nest? Did you have a male persistently singing on a territory? Those are the kinds of breeding behaviors that we're looking for. So I think the second atlas went from like 2009 to 2014, around then. And all the results are getting compiled into a book, which is getting ready to go to press very soon. I just saw the preview of the cover. So that's going to be a really, really cool resource for you all as master naturalists, because it's got like species accounts and really cool maps. So, you know, look for that in the next year or so, hopefully, to be coming out. And what's really great is that since this is the second atlas, we can compare those results to the first atlas, which occurred in the 1980s. So we can really look at trends in distribution and population and that kind of stuff. So I've got some really fun data and maps to share from the breeding bird atlas and looking at those changes between the two. I'll also do a little bit of identification. I know for some of you all that's not going to be super helpful, but for those of you who are a little more novice at learning about raptors, I might be able to share some helpful hints with you. And then we'll talk a little bit about migration and conservation as well. Okay, so this is kind of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. We'll talk about the State Wildlife Action Plan as well, which is something that the DNR has spearheaded. And then those are some of the species that we'll get into today. So I wanted to talk first, you know, it's always really helpful when we're talking about a group of animals to understand how those animals are related to one another. So have you all seen a phylogenetic tree before? Some of you have, some of you haven't. It takes you back to maybe your high school biology class. So basically, you know, this is a diagram of the relationship of organisms. And so anytime that the organisms are closer together on the tree, on like a branch, if you will, of the tree, those are more closely related. They share a more recent common ancestor. And so I just wanted to point out some of the relationships of the raptors. And you don't need to worry too much about like all these like fancy Latin names, but I just wanted to point out that up here we've got hawks and eagles are most closely related to the New World vultures. They're kind of on one branch. Then we've got owls. The owls are divided up into the barn owls, which is pictured here, as well as all the other owls, basically. And those are actually most related to woodpeckers. And then down here, we've got the falcons. They are actually more closely related to parrots than to the hawks and eagles and owls. And this is a really cool science that's come out in the last few years that we're starting to better understand these relationships. So does anyone know the term for when we've got two different types of organisms who are not at all closely related, but they have evolved the same adaptations to maybe live in the same kind of habitats or to do the same sort of things? Convergent evolution, yeah. And so that's why, falcons and hawks, they look really similar. They've got that curved beak. That curved beak is an adaptation to hunting, to ripping apart prey. And it just so happens that these two different lineages of birds both evolved that adaptation in order to exploit a resource. And it happened 2 times in two different avenues. So it's really neat. And one of the things that I find really fascinating about this story is that one of the ways that they're able to have evidence that the falcons and the parrots are closely related is they looked at their pattern of molt. So molting is something that all birds do every year, sometimes multiple times a year, and molting is the replacement of their feathers. And the way that a bird molts can be pretty different, but it sort of depends on what family that bird is in terms of what the pattern is, so when they replace their feathers, and what order they do it in. And so the molting pattern, so the timing and the which feathers get replaced when, is very, very similar within the parrots and the falcons. And so that's one of the ways that they knew that these birds are closely related, because we know that molt is highly conserved. That means that's a trait that gets passed down with certainty through generations. Yeah.
Do birds, like at the avian center, molt differently than those out in the wild?
That's a good question. So molting can have very seasonal patterns, and it can be dependent on things like food resources. So the short answer is I don't know, and that would be a really good question to ask them. But I know from my work in the tropics. So the tropics are a place where we tend to have less seasonality in the environment. Birds will definitely have way different molting strategies than a lot of the birds that are here in temperate climates, where a lot of the birds we have here in West Virginia are migratory, right? So they're coming to West Virginia to breed, and then they're flying south for the winter, and then they're coming back. So their lives are highly structured. So they're going to be breeding in the spring and summer. After they're breeding is when they're going to go through their molt. After they molt is when they're going to migrate. They have to separate these energetically stressful events in their life, because it takes too much energy to molt and to care for young at the same time. They're not able to do it. But now in the tropics, they still are not going to be breeding and molting at the exact same time. But what some birds will actually do in the tropics is if they're molting and they're going along, but then all of a sudden maybe there's a lot of rains. And with a lot of rains, there's like a more abundant food resources. They'll actually stop molting, and they'll say, wait, this is a really good time to breed, and they'll breed. And then when they're done breeding, then they'll keep continuing to molt. So my guess would be that because the raptors at the avian center are having like a really consistent diet, they're probably getting checked out by veterinarians, and they're going to be in really good health. They're not experiencing as much stress in their life, so they could potentially have really different timing of the molt, the pattern of the molt. So like, is it this feather on the wing versus this feather that gets replaced first? Is going to be the same. They're not going to change that, but the timing they could. Yeah, and please feel free, stop me at any time to ask these questions, or if you have something cool you want to say. So this slide, what we're seeing here is what we call species of greatest conservation need. Have you all heard this term before? Yeah, so some of you have, some of you haven't. So this list of species is based on the State Wildlife Action Plan, or the SWAP. This is a document that the DNR has produced, first in 2005 and again in 2015. And it's like a comprehensive look at the wildlife diversity of the state of West Virginia. They rank these species based on a variety of factors, their population trends, are they common or rare, is their habitat imperiled, are they facing threats? And so it's basically to direct our resources, which species are in most need of conservation. And so these are some of the species of greatest conservation need that are birds. We've got 75. And then the bolded ones are like priority, like they're really in need of conservation. And so I just put boxes around all of the hawks. It's quite a few. You know, some of these, well, we'll get into them. Some of these are only winter residents, so I'm not really going to talk about them too much in this talk. And we'll kind of get into you know, some of the reasons why some of these might be species of greatest conservation need. So this is a little bit more about the atlas, 2009 to 2014, as I mentioned. We've got the different regions of the state there in that map, showing you how we kind of broke things up there. There were more than 100 volunteers, more than 170 species observed with breeding behavior. And so all of this information is really great because it really gives us a comprehensive picture of birds across the whole state. So next we're just kind of going to get into some individual species accounts. So the osprey. Osprey are not super common in West Virginia. So each of the slides about the species is going to look pretty similar to this. So we've got two maps up at the top. So I'll kind of spend some time going over those for you. So over here, we've got blue squares. Those are observations where we had evidence of breeding behavior. And so each type of breeding behavior kind of gives us a certain degree of certainty about whether that bird is actually breeding in a location or not. Obviously, if we observed the bird with the, you know, on the nest, that's like, yes, that bird is breeding, we know that. Versus like if we had a male exhibiting territorial behavior for several weeks in a row, that's like, okay, that's pretty good evidence that if we've got a territorial bird, it's at least trying to breed there, so hopefully it found a mate. And so the different colors of blue kind of give you, like if it's dark blue, it's like confirmed, we know it's breeding there, and if it's like lighter blue, it's like, okay, it's possible or probable that that bird is breeding there. And then you can see circles that are gray as well. I know they're really small, if you can't see the shape, it's not that important. But the circles are the same thing if they're open versus like white to dark. The darker ones are confirmed observations. And it's just separated into circles and squares because we have what's called priority blocks and non-priority blocks. So remember I mentioned the state was divided up into all these squares, and so to target the effort into, you know, let's not have everybody, you know, around Morgantown and around Charleston, we probably have like really good coverage, right? Lots of volunteers going out to Kanawha State Forest and telling us which birds are breeding there. But we also need some folks to go down to the coal fields and tell us which birds are breeding there, right? So that's why we have these priority blocks across the state. And so that's the first map, just showing us where the birds are possibly or confirmed breeding for the most recent atlas. And then the second map you'll see on each slide is going to show you the change in distribution. So if you've got a blue square, that's going to tell you it was only present in the second atlas, 2009 to 2014, and it wasn't recorded in 83 to 89, I think is what that says. So if it's green, it was recorded in both the atlases, so that's kind of like no change, right? And then if it's yellow, it was only recorded in the 80s and not recorded more recently. So you can see with osprey, we had a few places where they sort of dropped out, but a lot more places where we were detecting them. Osprey, they are piscivorous, so fish-eating raptor. This is a bird that is really fun to watch out on lakes and rivers because they are going to plunge all the way into the water and swoop their wings to come out. They make their nests a lot of times on artificial structures, pilings, bridges, all kinds of places. They are pretty impressive hunters. You'll often see them like struggling to fly. They're so weighed down with the bird that they're carrying. But yeah, this is a bird that we're really seeing increase in population in West Virginia, both in the Ohio River Valley as well as in the eastern part of the state as well. And so to identify an osprey, certainly their habitat is going to be really important. Habitat is, whenever people ask me, what's the first thing I need to do to identify a bird, a lot of times they might say like, oh, well, what color is it? Or, what shape is it? What size? Those are really good things. But to me, you want to start with, okay, what habitat am I in? And also, what's the bird doing? So behavior is really important too. One behavior thing, the red arrow there pointing to they tend to hold their wings in a crook shape a lot of times. Bent at the wrists there. They're by water almost invariably. They've got that eye stripe. It was really distinctive, both the juveniles and the adults. And they're going to have a clean white breast. They're large. They will hover as well, which is pretty cool to watch. And on the underneath side of them, they've often, the adults especially, you've got that white with the black pattern that you can see. So golden eagles, this is one of the only species I'm going to talk about that is not a breeding bird in West Virginia, but it is definitely notable to talk about. It's estimated that the eastern golden eagle population has about 2,000 individuals. These are birds that are breeding probably up in Canada and spending the winter here in the central Appalachians, including West Virginia. They're going to be heading back to their breeding grounds by this time of year. So really in the winter time in the mountains is where you're going to be looking for these. This photo on the left is a camera trap photo. There is a professor at WVU. He's since moved on to working for the U.S. Geological Survey as a research biologist. But he's got a research program where he was setting out carcasses. That's a road-killed deer. You can see it's kind of staked to the ground, and this image is from a camera trap that's pointed at that carcass. And so they would put these out in, the Mon National Forest to try to see the golden eagles coming in to feed on them in the wintertime. So, and you can see that's a large bird compared to the deer there. So they're really neat. They're pretty rare in the state still. This slide is showing some tracking data. So this is satellite telemetry data. The eagles were captured and outfitted with a backpack satellite telemetry GPS unit. And a lot of the lines are starting out here in the boreal forest there. And so each color, that's going to be an individual's tracks. And so you can see that a lot of those individuals are migrating south and ending up in, coming through Pennsylvania, ending up in West Virginia, Western Virginia, down through Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina. That's where they're coming for the winter months. This is a small, geographically separate population from Western golden eagles. Golden eagles are certainly a lot more common to see out west because they are breeding out there as well as wintering. And so there's also research being done to find out, is this population genetically distinct? Does it warrant managing it separately as a separate population from the western ones? And what's really interesting is based on all these data, they found out that probably the entire migratory population passes through a really narrow corridor in Pennsylvania every year. And so this is really important when you're thinking about things like siting wind energy. Wind energy is super important, I think, but it also, those turbines are humongous. And they do pose a hazard to birds like eagles who can strike them and die. And so understanding the migration patterns of this, this small population of golden eagles is really important so that we know, okay, if the whole population is coming through this really narrow area, then we need to not put a big wind farm in that region. This is also some telemetry data from some birds wintering here in West Virginia. As you can see, I'm not sure how many individuals this is, but I imagine it's several. You can kind of see like, bubbles of local use, some areas. But what it tells you is that here in West Virginia, they really are heavily using the mountain regions as well as, it's really the same population that's going on into Western Virginia as well. So to identify golden eagles, it's really, you have to think about getting golden eagles confused with juvenile bald eagles. So we'll see some bald eagle identification in a little bit, but the juvenile bald eagles are all brown, but not all brown. There's a few key places where both of those species are going to have some white. So the juvenile golden eagles, top left there, they're going to have those large white patches on the wing, as well as that big white band on the tail. Versus the bald eagles, we'll see in a few minutes, they've got white in the armpits when they're juveniles, so really close up to the body. In all plumages, that's the axillaries, is the technical name for that. All of the plumages do have golden on the mantle, although that can be hard to see, especially because oftentimes when we're looking at raptors, they're above us, right? So here's our breeding bird atlas data from bald eagles. They have had a substantial population increase. They're the only eagle we have breeding here in the state. And they tend to be found in the Potomac River Valley and the Ohio River Valleys, where we have the highest population abundances, although certainly they're found, this region we've got a good number as well. They're increasing in the New and Greenbrier River watersheds, and this is, these population trends are pretty similar across much of the bald eagle range. They are kind of one of our poster children for the Endangered Species Act, because they were really heavily influenced by DDT. I'm sure all of you have heard that story many times, but it caused thinning of their eggshells, so they weren't able to successfully produce offspring, but their population has really come back since we banned that one pesticide. And in fact, if you just move slightly east in Virginia, the Chesapeake Bay region it's just exploding with eagles in the last few years, especially along the James River, where we have the densest breeding population of bald eagles anywhere outside of Alaska. Yeah, it's really, really neat. The Chesapeake Bay region actually has 3 distinct populations of bald eagles. We've got bald eagles that move in to breed. We've got bald eagles that move into winter, and then we actually have some eagles that use the bay year-round. So,
and what do they attribute that to, as far as that increase in population?
Well, so part of it is just that it's a natural population increase when they're able to more successfully reproduce. But on the James River and in the Chesapeake in general, one big reason why they're increasing is actually because of an invasive species called the blue catfish. This is a large fish that eats all the other fish. And so it's really creating, almost an imbalance in the aquatic ecosystem in a really, really big way, because it's such a voracious predator of a lot of our native fish. But what it produces is this amazing food source for bald eagles. And so that's actually one of the reasons why they're increasing. So, it's just one of those stories that goes to show how complex these ecological relationships can be when you start to crack the surface a little bit and dig deeper. And as you can see, I think we have like maybe one observation from the 1980s atlas. So it's pretty cool to see the difference. Oh, this is a fun series. So 1981, 97, 2005, 2010, 2016. So this has really been a recent rapid expansion. So the adult bald eagle, you're probably not going to mistake that bird. The white head and white tail. I am always on the lookout for bald eagles as I'm like driving. I drive on Route 19 a lot, so we've got some there on Summersville Lake. But if you're really far away and there's one in a tree, what you'll see is maybe you won't even see the shape of a bird. You're just going to see a white blob for the head and a white blob for the tail. So if you see like two white blobs in a tree, you should, like, your senses should start to tingle a little bit. And it's definitely worth checking out. But as I mentioned, you know, the juvenile bald eagles are largely brown as well, so it can be a little bit tricky to try to tell them apart from the golden eagles. But if you see them from the underneath, these white axillaries on the juveniles are going to be what you should key into. The eagles have what we call delayed plumage maturation, which is like a fancy way of saying that it takes them many years to reach that adult plumage with the white head and tail. So they typically don't get that until like 4.5 to 5 years. So, and as they go through their molt cycles each year, as a subadult, they're gonna get a different pattern of kind of brown and white.
How long do they live?
How long do they live?
Yes.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I bet at Three Rivers they would. You know, a lot of our birds of prey are going to be longer lived. So if I had to guess, don't quote me on this, but I would say probably at least like 15 years. But that's just a ballpark I'm throwing out based on kind of what I know. But in captivity, certainly they'll live a lot longer probably. We'll get into at the end kind of some of the ways that raptors are experiencing population pressure and some of the things that would be causing them to die prematurely. Okay, so moving on from the eagles, we're into the group of birds called accipiters. So within our hawks that we've got here locally, two of our biggest well-known groups of birds are going to be the accipiters versus the buteos, or buteos, however you want to say that. So, does anyone know some characteristics of the accipiters?
Longer tail.
Longer tail? Yeah, absolutely. The shape is very different between the accipiters and the buteos, and it's a really good thing to key in on when you see these birds. So the accipiters, they tend to be, when you see them flying, they tend to be shaped like a cross. So they've got relatively shorter wings, they've got a long tail, and they've got like a little head. Versus when you see a buteo, an example of a buteo would be like a red-tailed hawk, you know, one of our most common raptors. They've got long, broad wings and really short tails. I think I'll go back to this slide really quick because there we go. Didn't really go over that up in the top left. So the eagle on top, very large, distinct shape, broad wings. They're actually about the same size as a turkey vulture. I'm not getting into the vultures in this talk, although we certainly could have a whole presentation about vultures. Separating an eagle from the vultures based on size is difficult because they're similar in size. Turkey vultures, you're going to look for the teetering. They've got their wings held up in a V, and they almost always are going to be rocking like that. So the next bird down, the buteo, you can see those wings are still really, really broad, but the tail doesn't stick out super far, versus the accipiter is the third bird down, really rounded, short wings, really long tail sticking out. And then finally the falcon, pointy wings. Okay, so we'll go back here. Okay, went too far. Okay, so we've got 3 accipiters in West Virginia. The sharp-shinned hawk, the Cooper's hawk, and the northern goshawk. So we'll start here with the sharp-shinned hawk. All three of these species are specialists on hunting birds. So they're very agile, they're very fast, and they tend to have quick wing beats as well. Sharp-shinned hawks are the smallest of the three. They are a little more difficult to observe. They tend to be found within forests. That's one of their adaptations to living in forests, is that they've got really short wings. So they're very maneuverable for flying around trees. Their distribution here in West Virginia, you know, there's not a lot of real trends in terms of what part of the state they prefer, and we're not really certain whether they're increasing or decreasing or what's really going on, because we have relatively few observations from the breeding bird atlas. So it's difficult to ascertain what the population trend is because they're so secretive. The Cooper's hawk, this is probably the accipiter that would be most familiar to all of you. They are really well adapted to suburban living. So you can find them in cities, you can find them in farmland. They're still hunting birds there. This is the hawk that's probably going to be coming to your bird feeder to pick off birds if you have had that happen before. And you can see, based on their distribution, they're fairly widely distributed across the state. And you know, they've been exhibiting some places where they've seem to have declined, and other places where they seem to have increased. So there's not a lot of clear population trends for them either. For identifying them, the females are larger than the males. That's true with a lot of raptor species. And the reason I bring it up with the Coopers and the sharp-shins in particular is that you've got sharp-shinned hawks are small and Coopers are larger. But if you look at a female sharp-shinned hawk and a male Cooper's hawk, the size is like pretty overlapping. So size alone can be helpful for identifying these two, but it's not always definitive because you've got that sex difference. If you see the bird and it's perched, the Cooper's hawk has like almost a crest or like a funky hairdo. That can be one thing versus the smooth head of the sharp-shinned. You'll also notice that a sharp-shinned hawk tends to just have thinner, more delicate legs and a smaller bill. But anytime that you're trying to identify an accipiter, you really want to be looking for multiple field marks, and you really want to be looking for, do they all agree? So the tail shape and the length, the size of the head, wing beats, can you count the wing beats? Are they going so fast that you can't count them? The sharp-shins, they fly faster, so we call it snappier wing beats. So it definitely takes a lot of practice. I don't always get it, especially if so many times with raptors we just get such a quick glimpse. The northern goshawk, this is a pretty rare and elusive bird in West Virginia. They're going to be confined to the high mountains. They're the largest of the three, and you can identify them from the other accipiters based on their size, but also that white eyebrow is really important for them. Even though we did detect some in the more recent breeding bird atlas, we do think their population is continuing to decline and that they may possibly be on their way to becoming extirpated from West Virginia. It's not really known what would be causing these declines, but they're certainly a bird to be concerned about in West Virginia due to their rarity. Okay, so next we'll talk about a few of our beautios. Like I mentioned before, these are birds that are going to have more wider wings with shorter tails. They're going to be larger in size than the accipiters. They tend to be found both in forests, but also a lot more in open country. You're going to see the beautios soaring. You can see accipiters soaring too, but the red-shouldered hawk is our second largest breeding hawk in West Virginia, a little bit smaller than the red-tailed. It's really common and widespread. I had a pair of these nesting in my yard this spring. They have rapidly expanded in West Virginia and their population has increased by about 100%. So for birds that are more common and widespread, we're actually able to not just look at where it was observed in the 2 atlas periods, but now we're able to get a map like this, where we're seeing blue to red. This is from a statistical analysis called occupancy modeling, where we're actually able to take the data and predict whether a bird would occur there or not. And so it's showing the change in probability of occupancy. So is that bird at the location? And so you can see anywhere where we've got dark blue, that's where we're getting a large increase in probability of occupancy. Red is where we think a decrease would be occurring. This graph here, this is data from the Breeding Bird Survey. Is anyone familiar with the Breeding Bird Survey? Cool, so it's one of the longest running citizen science projects in the US. This is a roadside bird count where volunteers go out every spring and summer. You survey along a 25-mile long stretch of road, and that stretch of road has been surveyed every year since 1966. So you stop every half mile and you count birds for 3 minutes, and then you get in your car and you count birds some more. I'm going to go do one tomorrow morning. Anyway, so you can see the year here on the x-axis from 1966 on to about 2015, and then this is the the population here on the y-axis. So you can see a big increasing trend. These blue blocks, those just represent our 2 atlas periods in West Virginia to sort of help us compare from the 80s to more recently. So big population increases for them. So identifying the red-shouldered hawks. The first thing I always notice about them when they're flying over is that they have like a translucent crescent on the wing. It's going to be really visible when they're flying overhead. So that's sort of on the outer part of the wing there. Their tail, black and white stripes. That's another one that is usually pretty obvious. And then red on the shoulders if you're able to see that part of the bird. The broad-winged hawk is another buteo. This one is pretty common in West Virginia still, but it's not one that we see as much because it's not soaring out in the open country the way red shoulders and red tails will. This is a forest hawk. They really require mature, intact forests, and so we're seeing big population declines, about 47% in decline, as you can see based on the map. Probably drivers of that would be changing forest use, forest fragmentation, those sorts of things. They give a really high-pitched whistle noise, so that's usually the way I detect them when I'm out hiking in the forest, is I hear that whistle. You don't see them as often. To identify them, one of the key features when they're flying overhead is that they've always got a really dark black border around the edge of the wings. They also have a black and white striped tail, but the bands are much thicker than on the red-shouldered hawk. They also have pretty interesting behavior. They migrate in groups, in a big group known as a kettle. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. So the red-tailed hawk, this is a hawk probably most of y'all have seen many times in your life, I would assume. They are really common and widespread in open country. They're pretty tolerant of a wide range of habitats, and they've increased by about 18%. So I think one thing that you might take away from this presentation is that a lot of the species who are increasing we find that those tend to be species who are a little bit more generalist, who are a little bit more tolerant of a wide range of habitat types, of food sources, of human contact. Those are the birds that we're seeing are doing really well in our increasingly anthropogenic world. What we're seeing is that rare species, habitat specialists, these are the ones that probably tend to be declining. So to identify red-tailed hawks, there are a lot of different subspecies. So if you open up, your Sibley Guide to Bird, it's going to be showing you all these like Harlans and Criders and the exciting ones. Those are all out west. We've got the eastern red-tailed hawk here in West Virginia. And so what's really key for this is to look at the belly bands here. So right around the center of that belly, they've got dense brown streaking. And so you can see that on perched birds, you can see it on flying birds. Another thing to look for is patagial marks right here. They've usually got this, this dark mark right here. And raptor identification, for me at least, was like so tricky until, because you're looking at your field guide and you've got all these different things to look for, but sometimes it's hard to know, like, what are the things. Those patagial marks are a really good one to start to key in for on these guys. You notice that their chest, so above that belly band, is going to be clean and white. All right, let's talk about some owls now. The barn owl, as I mentioned, these are taxonomically separate from the rest of the owls. The barn owls are actually distributed worldwide, which is pretty cool. Here in West Virginia, they're very rare. It's difficult to find them, although we certainly did find a few during the atlas. They're secretive. They tend to be found farmlands and fields. They will make their nests in old barns, just like their name. I always really appreciate when an animal is like true to what its name is. There's some of them that you're sort of wondering, how did you get that name? But the barn owl, it's right where it should be. They nest in silos a lot too. You can find them in silos. Old buildings here, floofs. On the left, that bird is actually using a nest box. We do work with farmers to install barn owl nest boxes on their property, but we don't really know a whole lot about their true occurrence because it's difficult to survey for them. It's difficult to detect them. They're pretty secretive. The eastern screech owl, this is one of our most common owls, as well as one of our smallest owls here in West Virginia. They're pretty widespread throughout the state. They are pretty tolerant of a wide range of conditions as well. They do breed in cavities, so like holes in trees would be preferred by them. They'll also use nest boxes as well. They have a really cool song, or a call, I guess. It's like a trill. It kind of sounds like a ping pong ball being dropped. So they're a fun one to discover because they've got that nice tone. This is a gray morph. We also have a red morph screech owl, same species. It's like how some of us have brown hair and some of us have red hair. The red morph, I think, is a little less common than the gray. Great horned owls, also still pretty common, although their occurrence did decrease by about 25% since the atlas periods, which it's not really understood why, because they're a pretty tolerant owl. They're found around forest edges, woodlots. I think of them as being like sort of the most typical hoot owl. They say hoo 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 is like the call that they make. They've got ear tufts, so that's a good way to identify them. The barred owl, this is probably the owl you all have heard calling the most. Very, very vocal. The males and the females will actually sing duets. So if you're listening to an owl and you hear kind of like a call and a response and you think that there's two there, that can be a mated pair. They're singing a duet. You also can have individuals doing antagonistic calls. So if you're hearing them and they're like caterwauling and they're like really getting revved up, that could be like a territorial dispute between two individuals. They're found in forests and woodlands, swamp forests they really like. But they're pretty common. They increased by about 10% between the Atlas period, so a small increase. They, if you notice these photos, they can be active during the day. So diurnal owl, I see them active during the day a fair amount. They like to hunt for frogs and crayfish and other things like that. The northern saw-whet owl, our cutest owl. The northern saw-whet owl is breeding here in West Virginia, which is pretty cool, up in the high mountains. This is a bird that we historically did not know very much about until a project called Project Owlnet. Have any of y'all heard of that? Yeah. So this was started, I don't know, do you know? Like back in the 90s maybe? Some scientists started misnetting and banding owls, and it was thought that the saw-whet owl was like incredibly rare across all of the US, and folks started putting out some mist nets and using an audio tape to try to call them in. They are really responsive. They would do this during the fall migration when the birds are moving south, and it turned out that you can find them in lots of places. They're just very, very secretive and very small. So they will nest here in West Virginia in cool conifer and mixed forests. They are pretty difficult to detect if you don't know what you're looking for. And it's not really clear what their population trend is because we have pretty few detections of them, but probably there are more of them than we thought. All right, so next we'll move on to the kestrels. Falcons, rather. Kestrel is one example of a falcon. The kestrel is a bird of open country and farmlands. This is our smallest falcon here in the US. They nest in cavities, so like a natural tree cavity as you see here, although they will readily use nest boxes as well. And there's a lot of interest in establishing these nest boxes in farmland and open country because the kestrel is declining by about 35%. This is a bird that could be affected by kind of the changing landscape of West Virginia. So a lot of our farmland is being abandoned and reverted back into forest across the state. We kind of hit a peak with the number of farms operating in the state in the 1940s, and then since that peak, we've kind of been declining in the number of farms, and so a lot of those farms where they were once pasture or maybe crops, but not very intensively cropped land, a lot of that is becoming forest, or it's becoming like very clean farming, very clean, not any habitat. Your pastures and fields and cropland is going right up to the edge of everything. There's no margin anymore. And so it's causing declines in some of the birds that previously were able to coexist on these, grasslands on farms. And so that could be related to the population trends of the kestrel. They're a beautiful bird. The males and the females look differently. The female is going to be reddish, brownish overall, whereas the male has those really pretty slate blue wings. All of the falcons have pointed wings, so that can be pretty obvious in flight, although I get tricked with mourning doves and kestrels sometimes. The mourning doves have that long pointed tail, so once you see that, you're able to distinguish them. But one other characteristic that all the falcons share is what I call the falcon face. So they've got usually some mustache stripes. It's variable among the different falcons, but having that unique face pattern is really key. You can find them perched up on telephone wires, and they will hover as well. So if you see a bird hovering over a field, it's pretty small, it's probably a kestrel. They have fairly light and buoyant flight. They often eat insects and small rodents, that kind of thing. The merlin can be described as the kestrel on steroids. It's just slightly larger, but it's an extremely powerful raptor. So compared to a kestrel, they're going to be flying very fast. They're going to be flying very direct, and yeah, they're great. They're not very common in West Virginia, and in fact, were not here during the first breeding bird atlas. So this is a new bird. You can see those blue dots on the left map. That's around Elkins. There's a nest right around the city of Elkins that maybe it's already fledged, it's young by now, but I know a while ago, earlier this year, it was active, which is really cool. Population is rapidly increasing in the eastern U.S., which is pretty neat. You can see here their face is a little bit darker, but they do have that mustache stripe as well. They've still got that falcon face. There's a few different subspecies of falcons. Some of them tend to be paler, although we mainly have just one here. And like I said, they're similar in size to the kestrel, but they fly in a really different manner. They also, the kestrel's got that really clean lines on the face, whereas this one's got a much darker face. So they're really cool.
Is there any speculation why they've seemingly suddenly appeared?
I don't know. Yeah. It is really interesting. Now, sorry about that in a minute. So the peregrine falcon. The peregrine falcon, I think, is one of our most charismatic of the raptors. These guys, I think, have really captured the attention of a lot of folks. They're much larger than the other two falcons we just discussed. They are remarkably adaptive. So historically, they were only found nesting on cliffs, but now they actually do really well nesting on bridges, nesting near the tops of buildings. This is a falcon you can find in cities where they hunt pigeons. So, if you think about a city full of pigeons, this is a super abundant food source. And so it's really remarkable that the peregrine falcon has been able to exploit that food source. And it's funny because pigeons, they love living in cities because they're a cliff-dwelling species too, right? Rock pigeon is what we call them. And so those tall skyscrapers really act like that for both these species, which is really neat. They're not common in West Virginia still. This is a species that there have been a lot of efforts at recovering them since, DDT was a big problem for them as well. And the reason why DDT, this pesticide, is affecting these raptors is because they're at the top of the food chain. And so we call this bioaccumulation. If an insect pest consumes some pesticide, or a very low-level consumer eats that pesticide, and then the next level predator eats them, and it bioaccumulates up the food chain. So each individual in that chain is going to have a higher pesticide burden because they're eating so much of it. And so, in addition to just banning the pesticide, these guys have really been helped by reintroduction efforts. So folks who have bred them in captivity and released them. And you know, it's really interesting, in Virginia they've been doing that a lot, and so they actually, some of the birds they've been releasing, they bred with birds from the kind of the tundra, the Canadian tundra, where you have a lot of falcons. And now in Virginia, these birds actually really like the coast. And so they nest on bridges near the coast and the beach, and they pluck off shorebirds, and they're doing pretty well. It hasn't been quite as successful reintroducing them into these like mountain cliffside. The one on the left, to me, that is maybe, could be the New River Gorge Bridge. That's where I've seen them in the state. Identifying them, they've got long wings that are still pointed. They have really stiff wing beats. They actually fly in a really similar pattern to a cormorant in terms of the wing beats. They've got a really thick mustache stripe on their face. And they can be found, like I said, in urban areas, but also remote cliffs as well. Okay, so that kind of summarizes the species accounts. Before I move on, are there any questions about any of the individuals? Yeah.
This isn't about the individuals, but I was just wondering, between the last atlas and this one,
Yes.
did the number of people reporting have an effect on the numbers in the new distribution?
Good question. So what you're asking about, as biologists, we call that survey effort. And so quantifying the survey effort is extremely important in developing these population trends and looking at them. And I don't know what the survey effort was for the first atlas in the 80s. I would imagine we have more volunteers. You know, I think since the 80s, I think there's been more people interested in doing this kind of work. So certainly it could be. I know for a fact the species that were able to develop those models, the occupancy models for, that would certainly be taken into account for that. Although the ones where we had fewer occurrences, and so we're just looking at was it present or was it absent in the two surveys, for that it's probably not taken into account. So I think that's a really important thing to consider whenever we're trying to look at population trends.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Oh, good question. Is a harrier a falcon? So the northern harrier, they are not a falcon. They are not an accipiter. They are not a buteo. They're a harrier. Yeah, so I didn't include harrier here. They're a winter resident. They are really neat. They're not common in West Virginia. Have you seen them here in the state?
No, not in the state.
Not in the state, okay. Yeah. Yeah, so I know, you know, like in Virginia, we've got a few harriers. This is an open country bird, so you tend to find them wintering in farmland, but they have a lot of really neat behaviors. Yeah, they're yeah.
I have a question going all the way back to almost your first slide.
Yeah.
About the osprey.
Okay.
Okay, I saw on one of the energy companies' websites how they're trying to help them by checking the nest with drones and things.
Uh-huh.
So what do they do if they find that there's a nest? That means they don't send the people up on that hole? Or what does that mean? Okay, so now they know where they are.
Right.
Does that change what they do?
Right.
It didn't say anything about that part.
That's a good question, and I can't speak for what they would be doing, but what I can tell you is that any individual, company, government, organization, they are all required to comply with federal law. And so protecting birds, we have some fairly strong legislation which has taken a hit within the last few years. But so we have the Endangered Species Act. Osprey is not listed under that. We also have the Bald and Golden Eagle Treaty Act. So that is specifically protecting our eagles. They have a very high degree of protection. And then we also have the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So this is a law that goes back to 1908. So we just had the 110 anniversary, 1918 rather, so we just had the 100-year anniversary. And this law is actually a treaty between the US and Canada, and it came about because of, around that time, it was very fashionable and very popular to have hats with bird feathers in them. And so especially the herons, who have really elaborate, long plumages. Sometimes even entire birds would be on the hat. And this was just like a weird fashion trend. And so some people got together and realized that this was actually, you know, causing a lot of destruction, because these birds, like herons, they nested in colonies. So people were actually going in and causing really extensive damage to the entire colony all at once. And so they got together, they created this treaty, and so it protects birds from things like persecution, from you know, from having any sort of direct mortality to them. And so, like what you're asking about the power company, if they have an osprey nesting on their pole, they probably are going to not be allowed to do anything that's going to influence that bird. Although more recently, the way that that law is interpreted has changed with our current administration. And so what used to be illegal is something called incidental take. And so take is when you are causing the death of a bird. And so the law used to say that incidental take is illegal. So if you are going about your activities and accidentally kill a bird, like that's illegal. But now the law around that has, the interpretation of the law has relaxed with this administration.
So I was wondering if, I don't know what ospreys do. If they see that the nest is empty, then they can take it down. But I didn't know if that's the kind of bird that always goes to the same place. So when their nest isn't there, they go in a panic and have to come up with something else.
Right, yeah, so they will reuse nests year after year, but they can also build a new nest. So it probably would not be illegal for them to remove the nest if it's not occupied by a bird. Yes?
So follow up to that, she mentioned that they were using drones. I've heard using drones to monitor bird populations and bird nests can actually be damaging to them. Is that true, or?
Well, so probably most of you all have come to find a bird's nest as you're around your house or hiking in the woods maybe. And you know, when we get near a bird's nest, what do? They leave, or they really get agitated and attack us, or try to attack us, dive bomb us. If you've ever had bluebirds and you get close to your bluebird box. So yeah, it could be stressful. I do know that there also are bird researchers using drones, so I think it can be done in a safe manner. You know, when you think about influencing a bird's behavior, if what you're doing is causing that animal to react, you are harassing that animal. So I think there's definitely a way to use drones safely to look at nests, keeping the distance, but certainly you wouldn't want to be like really getting too close there. But I think the imaging you can get from them is really good. So I don't think you would have to really get that close into them. But you would have to have like a judicious drone pilot, you know, who is willing to take the safety of the bird into account. Okay, so next I wanted to talk a little bit about raptor migration. You know, migration is one of my areas of expertise. In graduate school, I studied songbird migration. And there's a lot of really exciting developments in studying migration lately. You know, here in West Virginia, we focus here on this map. This is showing some flyways of raptors. And so these green lines are sort of areas where birds are sort of funneling and using natural features to help them on their migration. All of our raptors are going to be diurnal migrants. They're migrating during the day. And as they're migrating, they're going to be looking to conserve as much energy as possible. And so if you're a bird, it takes a lot of energy to flap. So the more you can soar, the more energy you're going to save. And so the topography, especially here in the eastern US, has a lot of mountains. And mountains can actually sort of create funnels of birds. They're a big obstacle. What happens when you have a mountain chain, a lot of them here are running north to south, and so when crosswinds hit them, they hit ridges, It actually creates an updraft above that mountain. And so birds are able to use those updrafts to soar. And so another type of updraft they'll use is called a thermal. So that's where you have a pocket of warm air that gets warmed up and it rises up in a column. And so the birds will look for those thermals and find them. And when they get into a thermal, they'll start to fly in a circle, and the thermal is just gonna naturally take them up as that air rises. So you're gonna see the bird just not moving its wings at all, just sort of like moving around in a circle. And what happens is you get these updrafts and you get these thermals, and a lot of birds will come to use them together. So broadwing hawks are one that is one of the most visible and most spectacular that we can see here in the eastern US, because they will get into kettles of the thousands. So this picture on the left, those are all broadwing hawks. And that would be just like one little snapshot of the sky. You can have the sky filled with these hawks, all migrating together in a big group. And so a lot of our hawks are going to be continuing their migration down in Central and into South America as well. And so there's a lot of places where you can go and observe this spectacle. So a lot of places will have what we call a hawk watch site. So there's an organization, I think it's like the Hawk Migration Monitoring Network of the Americas. They support this website called hawkcount.org, and you can go on there and you can look at lots of different locations where folks are going out, counting the hawks during the fall and sometimes the spring as well. And so a lot of times in the eastern US, mountaintops are a really good spot to view the hawk migrations. And so one that we have locally is called Hanging Rock Raptor Observatory. Have any of y'all been there before? Yeah. Did you go in the fall?
Yes.
Yes. Were you able to see any raptors? It was just a nice sight.
It was a bad day for it.
It was a bad day for it, yeah. So they have I think it's an old fire tower there, and it's like a mile hike to get out there. But it's in the late summer through the late fall is the season of hawk migration, and the Raptor Observatory is staffed by volunteers during that time. I don't know if they go out every single day or a few days a week, that kind of thing. But it's out in Monroe County on Peters Mountain. And this chart here is pretty neat. I know it's probably a little small for y'all to see, but we've got different species going down the list. And this graph on the right side starts at January and ends here at December. And those orange bars are basically showing you the abundance of that species for that week. And so it shows you the different timing. So, we've got some earlier migrants like osprey are going to be migrating August through about October with like a peak in mid-September. You can see bald eagles, the next one down. They migrate over a long period of time, so there's not really like a time when all the bald eagles come through. They kind of trickle through all year. And these data is directly from Hanging Rock itself, so it's pretty neat. The broadwing hawks here, you can see their time is really concentrated with a peak like the last week of September. So if you want to go see these giant kettles of broadwing hawks, thinking about in September to go visit this spot would be really neat. Another one I wanted to mention, the Allegheny Front Migration Observatory in Dolly Sods. Have any of y'all been there? Cool, yeah. So, this bird observatory is not focused on raptors the way Hanging Rock is. They are doing mostly songbird banding. You can see this person here is handling a bird there. They've been banding songbirds since the 1960s, mid-August through mid-October every year, sometimes early October. But starting around 1990, they started doing a count of flyovers as well. So they are also counting raptors. And so that's up in the Mon National Forest near Dolly Sods. So that'd be a really nice place to check out too. Other places you could visit locally or not so locally. Hawk Mountain, Pennsylvania. This is another ridgetop site where you get a really impressive funnel of birds coming through. Cape May, New Jersey, and Peak, Virginia. These are really cool sites. So, you know, this is, Cape May is right here at the bottom of this peninsula in New Jersey. And Peak is here at the bottom of the Delmarva Peninsula. And these peninsulas also funnel birds, but in a different way. Does anyone have an idea of why birds would get concentrated at that tip of the peninsula? So a lot of the birds are actually averse to flying over water. So they sort of get funneled down this coastal migration path, and then they get down to the peninsula and they say, oh man, you know, you can't really see, but from the tip of Virginia, I think it's about 17 miles to get back to land. And so the birds tend to get concentrated down at the bottom of these peninsulas. And Peak in Virginia is actually one of the best places to see migrating merlins and peregrine falcons in the world. And so both of those locations have hawk watches where it's like a nice, you know, a big platform, and you'll have folks with spotting scopes up there in the fall. So probably like mid to late September is a really good time to see the peregrines and the merlins there. So it's well worth the trip.
So do they take a detour or what?
The birds?
Yeah.
Well, you will actually, what you can see is that birds will do like reverse migration, so they'll get down to the tip, and then you can see them flying back up, but they usually will then come back down and cross the water. It's interesting that we see this behavior of birds being really averse to crossing water because all kinds of birds fly across the Gulf of Mexico. Ruby-throated hummingbirds fly across the Gulf of Mexico. I don't know if any of y'all saw this really fascinating news story that I've seen several different organizations pick up. They have found songbirds in the stomach of tiger sharks in the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, so not all of the songbirds can make it across that water crossing, right? You know, birds rely on fat as a fuel source for these long migratory flights, and some of them just become exhausted if they're in poor condition, especially if they hit a headwind coming across. And so some of them, you know, they probably just get exhausted, land on the water, and sharks are eating them. It's fascinating stuff. So a couple other really cool spots to see raptors if you are interested in traveling internationally. Veracruz, Mexico is probably one of the best places in the world to see raptor migration. So, you know, this map of Mexico here is showing elevation. So these brown areas, those are mountain chains, and the green is lowlands. So as you can see, birds that are coming down the coastal route of Mexico, these mountain ranges are really funneling the birds into this very, very small, I think it gets to be about 15 miles wide there. And so you can have thousands and thousands of birds that just get funneled down through there. This is another kettle of broadwing hawks, up to 100,000 birds. It's amazing. Also, very large numbers of turkey vultures migrate through there as well. And Picoldi in Costa Rica is another really good site to see raptor migration as well. Veracruz has more than 90% of the world's population of Swainson's hawks and broadwinged hawks will pass through there. So it's just remarkable. Okay, finally, I just wanted to talk about some stressors and threats that raptors are facing, both here in West Virginia, but you know, these are not unique to West Virginia. These are threats that raptors are facing throughout their range. I'm sure as you all are at Three Rivers, you'll hear a lot more about some of these, because obviously if the raptors are needing to go visit the rehabilitation center, they've probably experienced one of these. You know, so direct persecution can have a problem with raptors. Illegal traps and shooting, whether intentional or unintentional, can have a really big problem. Raptors are longer lived. They're going to take longer to mature and reproduce. As we mentioned, bald eagles, those are going to take 4.5 years to get to maturity. So the loss of even a few can have a big consequence on populations. Hawks are colliding with a lot of objects, so whether that be vehicles or other types of collisions. We talked about wind turbines a little bit. I don't know if y'all have ever seen the blades of wind turbines when you drive by on the highway. I mean, they're the size of airplane wings. They're huge. And so, as we talked about before, sighting those in good locations is so important, because the more we're understanding about the migration of raptors and other birds is that we really do have areas where significant numbers of birds are concentrating. So the sighting is really important. Birds also collide with power lines, barbed wire fences. Some things that have been shown to help with that is actually putting markers on your fences. So just putting like a little tag, something visible, so that birds can see it rather than just not knowing it's there and hitting it. This is something that they're doing a lot with sage grouse out west. Is putting just these little plastic markers on the fences so that wildlife doesn't collide with it. With power lines, I know and other types of towers, they've started to experiment with using UV lights on power lines and towers. I don't know if this would be a deterrent to raptors, but most of the work has been focused on songbirds. Birds can see into the UV spectrum. A lot of birds have like UV plumage, which is really neat. I've been seeing lately pictures of puffins. You know how puffins have this really big bill? That whole thing is like UV lit up. It's wild. Yeah. Go look up pictures. It's really cool. But yeah, so UV lights, they're not going to influence humans because we can't see it, but birds will avoid it. Lead poisoning is a really big issue with raptors. Both from things like sinkers, when folks are fishing, discarded fishing gear is a really big problem for wildlife, both, the fishing line, those lead sinkers can be a really big problem, but also lead ammunition as well. And so whether that is ammunition left in a gut pile, that's going to be a really big problem. If you remember the picture I showed of the golden eagle coming to feed on a carcass, a lot of these raptors will absolutely scavenge, and a big old pile of guts is just like a great snack for them. So, there's an easy solution to that one, right? It's copper ammunition. It's more expensive, though, and so I think getting folks to adopt it has been really, really challenging. But it's one of those solutions that we have an easy answer to if we can get folks on board with that. And then, of course, anytime that we're talking about wildlife population declines and causes of mortality, habitat loss and climate change are going to be up there for almost all species, and it's no different with raptors as well. As we talked about, it's really the habitat specialists that we need to be most concerned about at this time. Those birds that are able to tolerate humans are doing a lot better. Those generalist birds are doing a lot better, but there's not an easy answer to that either. And I guess I'll just end the talk by talking about some of the work that I do that's not related to raptors at all. But as Becky mentioned, I work with the Cerulean Warbler Forest Enhancement Project. And this is a program for private landowners to create and enhance habitat on their land. And so we have funding through the Natural Resources Conservation Service. That's one of my employers. And typically the NRCS, I don't know if any of y'all have heard of them before, but they're an agency of the Department of Agriculture, federal agency. And historically they've worked with farmers and producers to help them implement conservation practices on their farms. The agency was actually started in the Dust Bowl when all of our nation's topsoil was just eroding away because of bad farming practices. And so what this agency does is help landowners, evaluate, okay, what's on your land, what do you have already, and what can we do to improve what you're working with. And we actually write, management plans, and we provide financial assistance as well. So I primarily work with forest landowners, folks who own at least 10 acres who want to do some work to manage that habitat for cerulean warblers in particular, but we also have a really nice program for the golden wing warbler as well. So, these types of habitat management projects are certainly becoming more and more common, and there's a lot of folks in agencies and nonprofits and folks like yourself who really want to see this type of work happen. So I think it's only going to continue, which is really good. Yeah.
Is that a nationwide project that you're doing?
The Cerulean Warbler Project is in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. Yeah. But the NRCS, this agency, is nationwide, and they have a whole program called Working Lands for Wildlife, and there's probably a dozen, maybe more, species that are targeted based on their range, that are really receiving a lot of funding to create this habitat. I mentioned the sage grouse is kind of the poster child out west who's receiving a lot of funding, but things like the New England cottontail, the bog turtle, I think the hellbender is starting now. So there's certainly opportunities. So that's pretty well all that I have for you all. If you have any, follow-up questions, or you want to ask me about, cerulean and golden wing warbler habitat, I'm happy to talk with y'all about that. But this is my contact info here, as well as the contact info for my supervisor, Rich Bailey. He's the state ornithologist. He spearheaded the second breeding bird atlas, so all of the data that I shared from that is what he compiled, and he's the one writing up the atlas. So certainly if you have questions about the breeding bird atlas data, you can get in touch with him as well. So I'd like to open it up if y'all have more questions. Becky, I don't know how much time we have before we need to start.
Well, we're doing pretty well.
So.
Yeah, it's 10:37, so we've got time.
What was the name of the location in Monroe County again for the?
It's called Hanging Rock.
Hanging Rock.
And what was that Cape May?
Oh, so what's at Cape May? So there's the Cape May Bird Observatory, and they do all kinds of stuff. So they have like naturalists on staff. I've never been up there to visit, but I would love to one day. So during the fall, especially, is when a lot of their programs happen. So they've got, all kinds of scientists up there studying the migratory birds and raptors and stuff.
Jessie, Cape May State Park caters to bird watchers.
Yeah.
Huge viewing decks right on the beach.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Birds that fly over.
I'll just take that to
It
the.
really is a park that
Although I would probably stay. It just depends.
it's a really good destination. And they have places on the shoreline that are places to watch, like waterfowl or raptors or songbirds.
Or the afternoon class.
There's a lot of birding activities going on.
Might not be, maybe.
There's also a lot of like really famous ornithologists who live in the tiny town of Cape May. Like a lot of the field guide authors who write your bird guides, they just live there because that's how good of a spot it is.
Conowingo Dam is a wonderful spot for you.
Okay.
Have you ever heard, have you gone there?
I haven't, no.
It's, I don't know, the lore is that the fish get shocked as they come through the hydroelectric. And I've taken a picture with as many as 20 eagles in a frame.
No kidding, what time of year, in the winter?
This was winter, yes. But if you look up bald eagle fishing, there's a 90% chance that's where the picture came from. They have a huge esplanade that gets loaded up with photographers and spotting scopes. But they'll fish right in front of you as well as 100 yards away. They spar with the juveniles. It's pretty cool.
That's great.
There
I
are
love
dozens and dozens.
I love when you can get a chance to really observe bird behavior deeply, like how, you know.
It's a good spot if anybody wants to go up there. Conowingo Dam, it's on the Severn River.
Bay Hook in Delaware is phenomenal as well for bald eagles. We saw tons and tons of juveniles, and